Day 1012 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 742,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional staggering 1,730 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 6 tanks, 14 APVs, 14 artillery, and 76 soft targets. But that's not including this Buhanka van, aka the loaf, when translated from Russian. Because although it is significantly damaged, it's still capable of a Russian joyride or donuts, possibly in some sort of drunken defeatist mindset, like we see here. Then, in keeping a keen eye on the Russian currency, the ruble price action closed out the weekend at about 107 rubles per US dollar, followed by emergency measures made by the Russian government late last week, albeit more short-term measures. And so to add a bit of context here, perhaps a humiliating Russian context of sorts, the Russian ruble has been declining in value since their SMO and even before that. However, it's the wider online community that was making a lot of fun of the Russian ruble that was teetering on the verge of about 100 rubles per US dollar for the past 6 months or so. And so although the Russian government plus the RCB intervened and brought the devaluation down from 114 to 107 rubles, the online community would have considered even a price of 101 or 102 rubles to be a steady but humiliatingly painful devaluation for the ruble. And yet out of all of it, this could just be the early days of the decline of the Russian currency. Then we'll head across to the map today, and a bit of a map issue, but we'll see how we go. With starting out in Bryansk, the Russian oblast, as local authorities have announced that several unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, were shot down earlier today, with a total of 4 confirmed incidents. Governor of the region, Bogomaz, reported that the air defense systems were activated in response to the threats, successfully neutralizing the UAVs. However, residents in the towns of Bryansk and Klinsky reported hearing loud explosions as the air defense systems engaged the drones, but footage shows what appears to be the outcome of UAV targeting of a militarily relevant site or two, as is the usual case, although further confirmations are needed with this event. Then headed to the oblast next door, as the capture of more newly minted Russian POWs continues in Kursk. With this most recent example of this Russian paratrooper from the VDV, which is the Russian Airborne Forces, who are or once were the elite branch of the armed forces of Russia, specializing in rapid deployment and airborne operations, where this VDV captured member stated that he signed a contract because he couldn't find a suitable job elsewhere in Russia, and so straight he goes into the elite forces. Which is something that adds to the reports of the Ukrainian troops that continue to advise upon the quality of the Russian troops that is just going downhill, as shortages of soldiers and constraints on Russian manpower increases, where in this man's case, he stated that he was just 1 out of 20 men from his unit that survived. Then also in Kursk, and subject to the very northwestern contact point, best to zoom out here for now. And so in a change of pace, we stumbled upon unusual footage of a destroyed Russian BTR APC in the region. Unusual because this was Russian supplied footage from their own potentially untrained FPV operators, taking out their own equipment. V marks the spot. They later claimed the vehicle was being used by Ukrainians for dugout protection, which seems unlikely given that that would mean the AFU troops captured the Russian BTR, then drove it back to a position of theirs, only to leave it very exposed, out in the relative open, getting hit by Russian fire. But whatever the case, what we can ultimately confirm here is Russia taking out Russian things. Then headed into Ukraine, down into the Donbas, as Russia is carrying out intense attacks in multiple sections of the Eastern Front, specifically where they attempt to break through Ukraine's defenses in the Donetsk Oblast towards the towns of Pokrovsk and Kharkova. Seen here is a Russian T-62 main battle tank of the 1960s getting smoked in the Pokrovsk direction. Then just south of that location, and seemingly impossible to zoom into, Russian forces continue mustering every available resource in the southeast in working the Kharkova pocket, usually with the deployment of T-90 tanks, which occurred at least every second day over the past 2 weeks, where we saw a destroyed T-90 or two. That is until the weekend came. In fact, recent reports indicate a notable surge in Russian T-90 tank losses this month, outpacing losses of other tank models. This spike appears tied to the specific units engaged in the current offensive rather than signaling the start of a new trend. After all, Russia's military industrial capacity doesn't churn out more than very low single-digit numbers of T-90 tanks per month, most of which, if not all, are upgrades. But even if they could produce dozens of these T-90M tanks per month, it's simply not economically feasible for them to do so with a price tag thereabouts at the $4 million mark per unit. Not really worth the high production volume, only to have them almost immediately destroyed in battle, also at high volume. So instead, this latest data appears to much closer align with the Russian MOD exhausting the best of their gear and units that they've rounded up for these later or latest pre-winter pushes. Then we'll head west, if the map allows us to do so today, as the region is gearing up for a potential Russian offensive, reported as per the region's governor Fedorov, where he also stated that the construction of heavy fortifications is nearly complete. These upgraded defenses are designed to enhance multi-level protection for Zaporizhzhia and nearby regions. Now, just earlier, on November 25th, I believe, President Zelensky highlighted that Ukraine is closely monitoring these movements, noting the existing threats as the fortifications were being put in place. Then headed to the much wider global map, as in a recent visit from Russian Defense Minister Belousov, who traveled to the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea, meeting with leader Kim Jong-un, who expressed his support for Russia's claims of self-defense in the ongoing SMO against Ukraine. This meeting looks to indicate or promote a strengthening of ties between North Korea and Russia amid the global tensions, with both nations seemingly united in their grievances against Western influence. Now, I bet that Belousov right here, the former Russian economist, never thought that he would be one day rubbing shoulders with one of the most isolated dictators in the world. And in doing so, essentially requesting more direct military aid from dictator Kim, whether it be a handful of North Korean quality level ballistic missiles, which are not that fantastic, alongside more of those vintage Soviet shell stockpiles North Korea has. Then also on the map globally, so amid growing revelations of Russian influence over Georgia's political landscape, the pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party enacted the suspension of European Union accession talks until 2028, citing alleged blackmail from Brussels. This latest decision sparked widespread protests across the country, with citizens expressing strong support for EU integration. The move has been criticised by domestic opposition and international observers, further intensifying concerns about democratic backsliding in Georgia and a potential shift toward authoritarianism and closer ties with Russia. So December, this month, is very likely shaping up to be a politically intense month for Georgia, as the Independent Party president's term comes to an end, right at a time when the newly claimed ruling Georgian Dream Party is expected to use its parliamentary majority to elect a Georgian Dream aligned president, consolidating power within the party. This all happens in December time, leading to the Georgian people continuing their fight for freedom, national sovereignty, and for their efforts to distance their country from Russian influence. Then also, globally speaking, and in a significant reshuffle of Russia's military leadership, Lieutenant General Sergei Kisel has been terminated from his role commanding Russian forces in Syria. The move comes amid growing scrutiny of Russia's operations in the region, with the Russian general fired after Syrian rebels launched a surprise offensive, seizing significant portions of the city of Aleppo and advancing into surrounding areas. So this latest development reflects a broader decline in Russia's military dominance as it struggles to maintain its grip on power in the Syrian Assad's longtime Moscow-backed sphere of influence, raising concerns about the sustainability of its strategic foothold and grip on power in the Middle East. Now, this region gets quite complex, but to briefly explain events in a Juzzie style, if you will, there's been a civil war in Syria since 2011. There are at least three main groups involved: the Kremlin-backed Assad regime, in red, controlling about 70% of the country. Then there's the Syrian Democratic Forces, in yellow, a coalition of Kurdish and Arab fighters controlling parts of northern Syria. And then there's the rebel groups, making all the headlines recently, a group incorporating various factions opposed to the Assad regime. With now, the Assad regime's forces were unable to hold Aleppo, the largest city in the country, losing most of it to the rebel forces, where the Russian armed forces also had to withdraw, given their inability to maintain area of control alongside the Assad forces, which becomes problematic for the Kremlin as this weakens Russia's influence in the Middle East, jeopardizing its Mediterranean military base of operations and its only naval base in the Mediterranean at Tartus, leading to a whole bunch of factors that can undermine its ability to maintain its sphere of influence, diminishing its global projection of power. As such, Russian state media now essentially proclaims it's all Ukraine's fault. Of course it is. Of course it is. Everything points to Ukraine apparently, which just goes to show you how these Russian state media narratives are controlled by the Kremlin, who is in turn controlled by their own knee-deep military miscalculations and failures in Ukraine, affecting their society on all levels now, forcing their military into this status quo, highly attritional status quo, that their military and economy cannot sustain indefinitely. It's quite the mess all round. Then headed across to a Russian military mobilization blunder and a funny to round it all off for today, guys. So starting with the blunder, as we saw most recently in Moscow, officers raided several venues, including the Arma nightclub and the Mono Bar, seizing smartphones, laptops, and video cameras while inspecting patrons' documents. Videos from social media captured the heavy police presence and the chaotic scenes, with officers ordering clubgoers to lie on the floor during the searches. Many men were reported to have been taken to military conscription offices, and women were eventually released after their passports were photographed. The raids with police canines lasted hours, and yet this is not a unique event. With events like these occurring in the past, possibly quarterly or biannually, the Russian war machine is getting desperate. But good luck getting them to find 1,500 young men every day to send them to meat waves in Ukraine. Then to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys, as what we see here is a Russian reporting correspondent that proudly reports about Russian volunteer territorial forces shooting down a Ukrainian drone. Problem was, it was a Russian Zala reconnaissance drone turning around back into Russian airspace, thereby showing how, once again, all of these various arms of the Russian military continue to put on display a total lack of ability to effectively communicate with each other. Now, not long after, this video was deleted from Russian media websites, but not before we were able to grab a copy. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like and comment, subscribe if not already, like I always say there, and thanks once again for all of the support. Really helps keep the channel going, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!